Hey, everybody. Nightly update. Under somewhat unusual circumstances, because as you might be able to tell by the thumbnail of this video, the subject matter, or at least one of the subjects that I'm going to discuss, is not what I would generally discuss on one of these streams, but hard to avoid today. And just going to wait for a few more people to trickle in before I begin. This is where I usually kill time with some humorous, or at least attempted humor, because you got to do something while you wait for people to file into the stream. Don't want to be just chatting to like one or two people. And I realize that some people watch these after the actual stream, so for them it's not applicable. But anyway, hello to all whoever are in, or aloha, as many people are saying. um, so I don't know about you, but when I first got a notification about the death of Kobe Bryant, I just was in a state of shock, or at least I couldn't process it right away. It's almost like it didn't register. What happened was, you know, on Twitter, people send me just stuff all the time. Some of it helpful, some of it not, and sometimes they just send me like random notifications about things. And somebody sent me a tweet from TMZ, which broke the news of the death, just as they broke it, if you remember, of Michael Jackson's death in 2009. And I'm sure that there are other deaths that they've broken in the meantime that I don't recall off the top of my head. But I couldn't process it. I was just staggered, and I think it's just because Kobe Bryant is somebody that you never even think twice about him being around for decades, basically for the rest of your life. And he was a fixture, definitely, of my youth and early adulthood, and even now he's sort of a fixture. And I personally am a basketball fan, NBA in particular, so I follow the NBA relatively closely. I'm not a fanatic, and I usually tune in a little more intensively in the playoffs, but I still follow it, definitely more so than any other sport. And man, he was just a global icon. And I don't know about you, but it's definitely one of the most, if not the most, shocking, celebrity deaths, so to say, that I can personally recall. Maybe since Michael Jackson. I guess Robin Williams is up there, but Kobe was young, and there was no premonition about him dying, right? So if there are some other celebrity deaths that came as a gigantic shock to you, let me know. Somebody mentions Whitney Houston. Yeah, I mean, Kobe was just different because he was just sort of a ubiquitous fixture of my youth and early adulthood. So just sort of different. It's sort of a cliche, but he did transcend basketball. Um, Definitely the most iconic player of his era. 5 championships. um, and just amazing athleticism and determination, and also a very intelligent person. Um, if you ever listen to him speak about the game, he was able to to intellectualize basketball in a way that a lot of athletes aren't able to communicate as well, about their sport. It's almost like he was a philosopher of basketball in a way. Um, but also, talked about other issues. He was into he was just starting, getting involved into other media. He had produced, I think, an Oscar-winning short film, um, and I somebody just mentioned that LeBron broke his points record last night. I watched the highlights of that game, and so I just had thought about Kobe hours before um, this death, and I'm trying to think back on now which sudden deaths shocked and jarred me like this one. I almost couldn't focus on anything else for several hours, even though I had other stuff to do. But sometimes life intervenes, and it was crazy. Um, Still is crazy. I've been trying to think of what other deaths had a similar impact. James Gandolfini would be one, although wasn't hugely shocking that he did die just because he was in poor physical condition, and others, you mourn when they have an illness or something and they get sick, but when you have just a out of nowhere death like this, yeah. Some people are saying Prince was pretty bad. Yeah. I don't know. Oddly, I feel like I have more of an emotional connection to Kobe for some reason, and I like Prince, and I was definitely moved by that death. But I wasn't like a Prince super fan. I like his stuff, obviously. So just a little different, um, in a way that I'm struggling to articulate. Chris Cornell, somebody mentions Anthony Bourdain. Yeah, those people just didn't have quite the same emotional resonance for me. Just because of my individual personality, I guess, and life and my preferences. Somebody it's William McKinley. That's funny. Um, Somebody's saying you seriously care about Kobe Bryant. That's sad, dude. I mean, sorry, I don't know what to tell you. Uh, it did affect me. Not that I knew him, but if somebody dies suddenly like this, who's sort of just sort of a fixture of your your life. I mean, it's not surprising that they would have an impact. Um, Number one, I've always had sort of a latent phobia of helicopters. I don't think I've ever been on a helicopter. I was trying to think earlier today. Have I ever been on a helicopter? I don't think I have been. I have been on a small, like, single engine plane a couple times, and even then, I felt paranoid. Um, but a plane seems safer because if you have an engine malfunction, at least you could still like have a chance of surviving because it sort of glides to you can glide to safety. Like for example, I was in Alaska in the summer of 2018, and I took the Maritime Highway. It's called, out to a remote island, and in order to get from like one island to another, you had to take up a single engine plane trip. And so in this single engine plane, you're low. The altitude is very low. I don't know if you've been on one of those, but so you're literally flying between mountains and stuff, and it was a little jarring if you never experienced that. Uh, yeah, but ultimately I knew that it was a little bit of irrational to get worked up, but don't think that I particularly want to take any helicopter rides anytime soon. And I know that there's a thing about how people react differently to celebrities than normal people. Sure, just that normal people aren't ubiquitously known. So obviously the reaction is going to be somewhat different, and I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. Maybe you should just try to extend your empathy outward toward more people and try to feel an emotional attachment to more people. rather than less, rather than complaining about people getting upset about the death of one particular person who had a sort of singular impact. Um, yeah, it was. It did shake me up. Um, and it's funny. I was at when I heard the news, when I got the notification. I'm here in New Hampshire. I was in Plymouth, and I was at actually the Bernie field office in Plymouth, just checking it out and talking to the people there. All really nice, and it just sort of interrupted my thought process. My flow, so to say. um, and interestingly, Tulsi came by. I don't know. You might have seen my tweet before, but Tulsi decided to stop by and say hello to the people at the Bernie field office shortly after the news broke. And obviously, they didn't. It came up, so we all were all kind of like standing there talking about it. It's just sort of surreal. But she did decide to come to the Bernie field office. Obviously, Bernie's got orders of magnitude more money than she does, so he's got field office everywhere in New Hampshire and in Iowa and the early states. So Tulsi just happened to be in Plymouth today and was sort of doing. She had a town hall as usual, but what she sort of does on a typical day is goes from sort of the main drag in the town that she's in and stops in businesses, restaurants, bars, shops, everything. And she decided to make a stop at the Bernie headquarters, and the reaction was great. I mean, she the lead sort of field organizer there, his name is Matt. Hello, if you're watching. It's very kind and accommodating. Told me that she was his second choice, for whatever that's worth. And a couple of interns were there, one of which asked me, and this happens occasionally, and it's always sort of a double-edged sword because you never know what their precise reaction is going to be. But the guy, who's one of the Bernie interns, after I talked to him for a little bit, said, "Wait, aren't you Twitter famous?" I'm like, "Whoa, no, it's not me. It's not me. I disavow. I denounce." But yeah, I admitted that Twitter famous is kind of a silly term, but I do have that presence. So had an interesting conversation, and the guy that I talked to actually was from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is where roughly where Kobe is originally from. So it had a special sort of impact on him. And I see somebody in the comments mentioning an incident that was obviously negative that Kobe was implicated in when was like 17 years ago. It's just like, why the instinct to dwell on that right now? I mean, I'm all for the legacy of public figures being scrutinized, but the guy was a basketball player, right? He's not Henry Kissinger or something who died in a tragic premature way. So like the instinct on the part of some of the media, some online, to unearth the most sordid aspects of somebody's life when he dies. It's just what's the point? Why are you doing that? To make a statement? To show how attuned you are to issues? To me, it just seems gratuitous. And again, I'm not saying that you should self-censor necessarily. I'm just saying I try to question your instincts if that's sort of what you're bringing up. And yeah, as people are pointing out, one of his daughters, Gianna, was on the flight, who also died. And I saw a viral clip of them from just last month where Kobe and his daughter, who also died, are sitting courtside at an NBA game, and he's sort of like explaining some of the mechanics of the basketball game to her, and she's also a basketball player. In fact, they died on a helicopter trip to a tournament that she was participating in, where he sort of coaches. Um, so yeah, it was just it was rough. It's tough. I watched some of the highlights of some of the games that happened today. Apparently, they didn't cancel them. The games went forward, but what they did was each team they did like a tribute, obviously, and then each team took a 24-second violation, um, and that was his number, which is fitting. Just hard to imagine that those guys could play on a day like today with their heart in it. So I would maybe have recommended canceling the games, honestly, but I'm not the commissioner of the NBA. Um, uh, yeah, so figured I would lead with that. Um, I uh, I saw Tulsi put out a tweet of condolences, and then I just saw this. Of course, the top reply on Twitter to the tweet is to some troll saying Kobe and his wife Vanessa would not appreciate a Russian operative speaking on his behalf at this time. So yeah, it's a random troll. Random trolls online say crazy things. I get it, but somehow the Twitter algorithm brings that to the top and puts it right below her tweet. I mean, give me a break. I will never have. As melodramatic as this sounds, I really will never forgive the people who inflicted that sickness on the body politic and made it such that even somebody offering just politically neutral, politically condolences in a way that's totally politically neutral, automatically gets bombarded with this junk. It's just, it's so tedious, but it's not going away. Yeah. So, has anybody in the chat ever been on a helicopter? Because I'm sort of curious now if this makes you reevaluate whether you feel that riding on helicopters is safe. I've heard mixed reactions from people. Some of whom were saying that your paranoia or your apprehension about helicopters is well founded because essentially the aerodynamics of a helicopter are basically you're almost fighting against physics. And so if one little thing goes wrong mechanically, then you're done for. Whereas an airplane is different. I'm not an expert on those types of things, but it just seems like if you encounter suboptimal weather conditions on a helicopter, you're going to be much worse off than you encounter them in a plane. And so maybe it is a little irrational to just not want to go on helicopters, but because crazy accidents do happen. But man, it just seems like I wouldn't be totally comfortable going on. Yeah, so Tulsi, she at her town hall in Plymouth, um, she was asked a question that was interesting because I hadn't heard her really address this before. It was somebody who was saying, questioning, because she does emphasize the need to transcend hyperpartisanship quite a bit, right, and not allow partisanship to dictate what you think is dictate how you operate politically, which has some merit to it. But you do run into sort of some questions. So, like, if the Republicans are dead set against anything you want to do in terms of enacting kind of like a single payer healthcare program, how do you navigate that? Right. So there's potential tension there in some of what she prescribes. Although I think she has answers to it, but to that tension. But what somebody asked was, the guy said, recently Joe Biden has talked about how he thinks that the Republicans will revert back to their pre-Trump state once Trump is out of power. And by that, Joe Biden meant that Biden will be able to negotiate and work with Republicans um, once Trump is gone, because Trump has sort of corrupted the Republican Party. And the guy was asked Tulsi if she agrees with that, and she said no. She doesn't think that there's going to be, the word she used, this magical snapback to some bygone era of Republican rationality, where they're just willing to, work together to get things done. So that was sort of interesting because, Tulsi obviously does not want Republicans to be in power. She said that one of the adverse consequences of impeachment is that it makes it more likely that Trump and a Republican Congress will be reelected, and she says that would be a disaster for the country. So, arguably, again, there is a bit of a tension between asserting that and also asserting your willingness to engage with Republicans legislatively. Now, I think that tension is resolvable, but it was sort of interesting to hear her sort of prodded on that point by a questioner who made an intelligent point at this town hall. Another interesting questioner. I guess you can go watch a live stream of her event, because the live streams have resumed. They stopped for about a week because of just staffing issues. But one guy who spoke was he was a Marine who was in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he was telling some interesting stories about how he was there during one of the surges in 2009 in Afghanistan, and he was recalling how his commanders were saying, you guys are going to go down in history. Everybody's going to remember you for this valiant surge. And the Marine was like, remember us for what? Because the mission was never well defined. It was never directed toward actually achieving anything sustainable. And the guy became super alienated with the strategy put forth by the military leadership and the political civilian leadership. And so he had a really interesting exchange with Tulsi, and then I talked to the guy afterwards, and he was telling all kinds of crazy stories. The guy was injured by an IED in Afghanistan when he was just walking down a road. He wasn't even in a vehicle. And he had to be flown to the facility in Germany, where now some of the soldiers who were injured in the Iran missile strikes a few weeks ago after the Soleimani assassination had to also be flown because they ended up having concussive symptoms. So basically traumatic brain injury, which I saw today Tom Cotton and even Trump trying to downplay as insignificant. No, I think actually severe concussions are significant injuries. I don't know the full extent of each individual person's injuries, but if they're still being treated now, weeks later, maybe that's a problem, right? So I would not be so glib in dismissing the ramifications of sustaining an injury like that. And it's just a product of why that escalation was so unnecessary, and why even now we're, yes, in a state of war, not World War III, granted, thankfully. I never said that World War III was imminent. I know people like to erect a straw man where if you were critical of the Soleimani assassination and the subsequent escalation and everything which led up to that point, you're wrong because it didn't eventuate in World War III, as if not resulting in World War III is like the bar you have to clear in order for something to be good. No, you could still cause a bad set of circumstances that doesn't rise to the level of World War III, and it's still bad. And just today, apparently the U.S. embassy was directly hit by rocket fire that we don't know the exact provenance of yet, but it's a rarity for the rockets to make a direct hit in the way that they did today. And so we want to hear a little more information about that. But Yeah. So this guy was, was an interesting guy. He actually came from Vermont to come to the event, and he's independent and was just, again, telling all kinds of crazy stories. Tulsi definitely does have a unique resonance with people in the military, that, in my experience, because she sort of speaks their language, and it's a specific type of language that if you haven't been immersed in military culture and military rhetoric, doesn't come naturally to you. And so, you just don't know you just don't have the vocabulary necessarily that they do. And even one of the cops in the back of the room, I noticed tonight, was applauding just when she was talking about something that wasn't even related to the military, Social Security. She was talking about Social Security and the need to lift the cap, and the need for lift the cap, meaning people at higher incomes need to keep paying into Social Security even after they reach a certain income threshold, to keep it viable. And she also said she advocated codifying in a statute that the Social Security fund can never be rated. And the audience tonight was a little bit older, generally speaking, and so they all loved that. Um, and I saw the cop clapping as well in the back of the room. So after the event, just chatted with him, and yeah, he said he liked her, and uh, uh, in part because he was also in the military back in the day, and that just sort of creates a sort of intrinsic connection, or has an intrinsic appeal, and it's something that's hard to maybe grasp if you haven't been in that culture. Um, so it's part of the reason why you have people who maybe like her sort of the disposition that was instilled in her through her military background, who may not be ardently progressive, right, or even ideological at all, who just appreciate the way that she frames issues, and then theoretically could get on board with something like a single payer program, just because they sort of trust the way that she presents the issues. That's sort of interesting for me personally, just to observe and in following her around and speaking to the people who come to her events and interact with her. Um, like I said, she does um, these sort of small scale business type uh, greeting. She goes to bars and restaurants and stuff and talks to people. And so she went to a place today and met the people. They all really liked her. And one guy who I was talking to, who chatted with her a little bit and took a picture with her, he was like, "Yeah, I don't care much about politics, but I'll vote for her now because I just think." Just because it's super cool that she came into this bar and just chatted with people. So for some voters, it's just a matter of making a personal connection with them. They're not that politically driven. They're not analyzing the policy proposals of the candidates, right? They just want to feel like they have some want to like get an authentic connection with somebody. And maybe that's not the most healthy way to approach politics, because somebody who has a sinister political agenda could theoretically come and have an authentic interaction with you. And if you vote for that person, it's probably not the greatest thing. But sometimes you have to just meet voters where they are, and recognize that your priorities can't be easily transposed onto them. They have their own priorities, their own ways of thinking, and so that's why politicians go around and try to make as many personal connections as possible if they can. Um, Even the Bernie canvassers I was talking to today, the volunteers and the staff at the field office, were saying that uh, they sometimes talk to people just like, again, aren't usually ideological. Like one guy was telling me that he was talking to a voter who was trying to decide between Bernie and Biden, who voted for Biden last time. So he's still weighing the choice. And he was saying that, yeah, I mean, the reasons I was voting for Bernie is I just feel like he's consistent and I can trust him. So, not a political argument, really a personality argument, which, if that's what voters prioritize in their minds, so be it. Not everybody is going to be voting on a set of issues. And sometimes they just have sort of like a bundle of instincts or impulses that guide their decision making in terms of what their voting preference may be. And that's something that when you go out and you make a point to talk to voters, whether it's through in a journalistic capacity or through a canvassing or in a volunteer capacity with a campaign, it's just something you come to understand more and more in terms of how people sort of formulate in their minds what their political and candidate preferences are. So interesting. What else? So there was another bombshell today that broke late when the New York Times published an account of what is supposedly in John Bolton's upcoming book. I don't know how John Bolton wrote this book so quickly. He wasn't fired that long ago. Well, I mean, I guess I get it. But in the book, apparently, Trump says that he wants to withhold military aid until he gets an Biden investigation. Okay. I don't know if that's true or not. Whatever. It just, the irony and the absurdity does strike me of Democrats desperately waiting around for John Bolton to come and provide this silver bullet to their impeachment case. The impeachment vote didn't need to happen on December 18th when it happened. They wanted to get the impeachment vote over with by Christmas. And then a couple weeks later, Bolton says, "Hey, I'll testify." So why didn't they just wait for Bolton to testify in the context of a House impeachment proceeding? It doesn't make any sense in terms of the timeline. They said initially they needed to get the impeachment done and over with because there was a crime in progress, and they needed to make sure that Trump was held to account before the 2020 election could happen. So why not then wait an extra month? And on top of that, then you wouldn't have the senators running for president holed up in D.C. a week before the Iowa caucus, which is like, even if you don't support those senators, it is sort of an affront to democracy in a way that they're being confined to the Senate chamber right now when they ought to be campaigning in Iowa. And so the rationale behind this whole thing is ridiculous. I just feel like holding up John Bolton as a savior figure. I mean, step back and think about what you're doing. John Bolton, he's now the pinnacle of virtue. Who's going to swoop in and save the day from Trump's malfeasance? I mean, give me a break. It's just ridiculous. All right, people. Hope that was illuminating. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that occurred today that I forgot about. Oh, I didn't do a stream last night. But I talked to another gentleman who was interesting. He was at Tulsi's event yesterday, and it was a gentleman who was a older guy who told me he voted for Bernie in 2016. The primary still liked Bernie, but was going to be voting for Tulsi now. And I asked him to explain why, and he said, "Well, he's a retired machinist." Okay, I'm being implored to read my super chats. Sorry. Let me see. My good friend Sparky is giving me more super chats. Probably my Sparky's kind of my sugar daddy at this point because he's just so generous with his super chats. He says Pompeo, Abrams, and Haspel conspire to mislead Trump. Possibly, but ultimately the responsibility for that lies with Trump because he's the one who puts them in their positions. Tulsi understands the importance of small business, says Sparky. I suppose. Sure. Sparky says Tulsi knows some trust busting is needed. Okay. I'll let that stand as a comment. Sparky adds Tulsi is a better leader than the rest combined. Okay. Sparky says Bernie's campaign may falter. Push for Tulsi. Well, she's making a push in New Hampshire, that's for sure. There was a poll today that came out that had her at 7%. Pretty good for her. I would say if she were to get into the double digits, maybe mid to high double digits, and potentially even a place ahead of one of the quote unquote leading candidates. Excuse me, like a Warren or a Pete or something. That would be a massive boost to her, especially if she's able to get some delegates from New Hampshire. But have to see. Maybe this is my just my tunnel vision because I'm focusing on her. But when I see her interact with voters, almost inevitably they come out having a much more favorable impression of her and even supporting her. And I've seen that over and over and over again, which shows that she does have some political skill that maybe doesn't get portrayed in the way that you might think in the popular media. What was I saying? Oh, okay. So yeah. So last night there was an event in Moultonsboro, New Hampshire. We're out here in way north rural New Hampshire right now. And the gentleman said he was a retired machinist who was also a union representative, like a shop steward at a defense manufacturer in Massachusetts. Now lives in New Hampshire. And I asked him to explain why he voted for Bernie in 2016 and was now voting for Tulsi because the guy asked a question at the event and thanked her for supporting Bernie in 2016. Now he's voting for Tulsi, and I asked him to explain why. And he gave an interesting and I think sharp answer, which is that he believes, based on his experience as a union rep and a blue collar, I think that's how he described himself, blue collar machinist, working in the defense industry, he believes that the industry has gotten increasingly corrupt. And he was talking about the military industrial complex, and he felt that Tulsi was better situated to address that corruption. And he still likes Bernie, but he felt that Tulsi was more in need of his vote. So that was his explanation. So those people are around and they do exist. Okay. More from Nick Von Liphart says, tell us a worthwhile interview with John Stossel. I remember that when that came out, but I actually have not watched that one. I've watched a lot of her stuff, obviously, but got to go back and watch that one. And there, John Stossel, obviously a libertarian, and there are always a section of libertarians who are at her events. And when I talk to them or encounter them, I usually ask them to explain, how do you reconcile as a libertarian supporting someone or voting for someone who advocates stuff like a single version of a single payer healthcare program? And the answer is almost always the same, which is that that's not a priority for them relative to the priority of changing U.S. foreign policy. Yeah. And I've heard that many times now, and it's a recurring theme. Sparky says, when you're not shilling for big pharma, the military industrial complex, or the prison industrial complex, you're a pretty good journalist. Okay, thank you. I'll continue shilling for those industries. And then Sparky adds, just kidding. Gotcha. Let me scroll through some of my notes to see if there's anything else that I'd like to touch on. Oh yeah, so the polls right now you're going to get a flood of polls, especially until Iowa. My advice for assessing polls is do not fixate on any one particular poll. I mean, this should be rule number one when talking about polls, because there are some polls that came out today that showed Bernie substantially ahead in Iowa, a couple that showed him not as ahead. It's just like you're not going to have an answer on who's ahead and who's behind that's definitive until the vote, because the race is volatile. Lots of people are still undecided. Even in New Hampshire, which I'm focusing on, I talk to people who are undecided all the time, and not even involving Tulsi. Like there was a woman who I spoke to, who was a very nice librarian at this in this rural town, who's just like a local member of the local Democratic Party group, and goes to every event that a candidate's hold in her little town of Andover. Is it Andover? Yeah, Andover. And so she didn't support Tulsi, but she went to the Tulsi event just because she's a Democrat, right? And I was talking to the woman about what her preference was in terms of candidates, and she was like, "Yeah, I'm trying to decide. I'm undecided. I like Warren, and I like Klobuchar. I, I- and I like Warren the best, but I don't think a progressive could necessarily win, so I might vote for Klobuchar." It was sort of like the New York Times logic when they issued that joint endorsement. Um, the thing I said to her, and I said this to anybody, whether Tulsi or Bernie or whoever is involved. I'm saying, don't vote on based. Don't vote. My recommendation is vote for who you think is the best candidate. Don't vote based on some pundit speculation that you're making in terms of how you think other people will vote in 9 months. We don't know what's going to happen in the intervening months in terms of whatever. It's just like there's no use playing pundit and trying to predict how others will vote. So it's like a version of the electability thing. Yeah, just vote on who you think is best. That's my recommendation. I think it's useless to vote based on some prediction about who's going to fare best. And I think the point of the primary is just to make a selection based on who you think has run the best campaign or most aligns with your political sensibility or whatever. We have enough pundits, so don't be a pundit in your voting behavior. That was my recommendation to her. And in her case, it means just vote for Elizabeth Warren then. So I'm not saying I agree with her voting choice. I'm saying what I think that the correct logic is that you should employ when determining your voting choice. Um, yeah. Okay. Let me just scroll through and see if there's anything else that I left out from today or yesterday. Do 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 do. Yeah, that's about it. I'll leave it there for now. It's a little late. I got some other stuff to do. So thank you for tuning in, everybody. Hope I provided you with some insights that you would not otherwise receive on your YouTube feeds. And sleep tight. R.I.P. Kobe. And I'll talk to you later.